y bienvenidos, buen provecho otra vez a la segunda sesión del primer día de jornada de justicia y salud mental, un nuevo paradigma. La conferencia inicial de la tarde estará a cargo de la doctora Vinson, que es catedrática de psiquiatría del Morehouse School of Medicine y está certificada en niños y adolescentes, personas adultas y en psiquiatría forense. Entre los muchos haberes de la doctora Vinson está ser la directora interina del Departamento de Psiquiatría and Behavioral Sciences at Morehouse School of Medicine, where she was the lead architect and is the program director for the Child Psychiatry Fellowship. She's the first at an HBCU medical school, is that correct? Good. So, también ella ha estado extremadamente, I'm translating, envuelta en el trabajo, con el trabajo en primera fila con los jueces y las juezas en los Estados Unidos, y es una leading scholar en esta área, sobre todo en asuntos de la niñez. Así que tengo el inmenso honor de presentar a la doctora Sarah Vinson.
Good afternoon. All right, so I pulled the spot right after lunch, which is not ideal. So I will be pausing every 20 or 30 slides, and I want to hear from you. I want your questions, I want your comments, because I want this to be as relevant to you as possible. And in order for that to happen, I want this to go two ways, okay? So we'll be pausing, and I will have some help with interpretation so that we can have a dialogue and this isn't just me up here talking. So it's an honor and a pleasure for me to join you today. I actually absolutely love the Caribbean. I've been to 10 Caribbean islands. And so any excuse to come, I'm like, sign me up. So people have been thanking me for coming, but no, thank you for having me and for giving me an excuse to come here. That won't get me in trouble with my boss. And so I'm happy to talk to you today about social injustice in children's mental health and considerations as it relates to it. And of course, this is my area of scholarship and something I've done as an academic and as a professional, but as I'm sure is the case for many of you, my professional work, my professional passion, my professional identity is in large part shaped by who I am as a person and things that shaped my family and my early experiences growing up. I grew up in a small town in Northwest Florida, which you guys will hear a little bit about, but I kind of spent my weekdays in an area that was predominantly white and mostly middle class, and spent my weekends in areas that were predominantly black and often lower socioeconomic status. And so I was with my cousins and my grandma on the weekends and in these very white, privileged environments Monday through Friday. And so the things I'm talking to you about, inequities, disparities, differences in opportunity, are things that I saw growing up. I didn't have language for it. I didn't necessarily have a framework for it, but it was something that I noticed very early on, right? That there were things that were available to me that weren't available to other people in my family, and that a lot of the things that were available to people who looked like me weren't universally so. And so it's no surprise that as the daughter of a probation officer and former police officer, and as someone who was in a family that was touched by mass incarceration, in a family where when my uncles sometimes got out of prison, they stayed with us as they transitioned back into the community, that as I went to medical school, I ended up at this intersection of law and of mental health. So our objectives today are to identify the relevance of social justice in children's mental health in order to re-examine mental health and illness in our society, discuss the impact of social hierarchies on diagnostic processes and classifications in order to better serve patients from marginalized communities, and to self-evaluate the concept of social justice advocacy in order to identify action steps that can be taken to advance justice. So often in these rooms, there's a lot of talk about diversion, right? But at the point of diversion, something has gone wrong. Somebody's in trouble. The criminal justice system is already involved. And when we're talking about kids, and even when we're talking about adults, I would argue that diversion is very late in the game to start thinking about these issues, right? Why is it that there are so many people in need of diversion? What was the direction that they were set in early in life, and what were their developmental conditions like? And so as a child-trained psychiatrist, even when I'm doing a forensic mental health consult on an adult, I'm always thinking about it through this developmental lens. How did this person end up here? What were the things that contributed early on to this life trajectory that landed them in this court on this day or in this prison on this day? And so as we're going through these concepts, as we're going through this talk, as you're thinking about how this applies to the people that come before you in court, I welcome you to always pair thoughts of diversion with thoughts of direction and of development as well. So when we're thinking about inequity, a lot of times there's a focus on cultural competency, and this is the idea that we are taking into account people's behaviors, their attitudes, policies that shape their interactions with people. And we're trying to be mindful of the fact that maybe our culture is different than that of someone we're evaluating or making decisions about, and that with cultural competence, you are being intentional about trying to account for that, trying to learn about cultures that are different than your own, and safeguarding against that getting in the way of being fair or equitable to people. But cultural competence really focuses on the individual, it focuses on the person, and often it focuses on the minoritized group or the group that doesn't have as much power. And so there are some pitfalls that can come with that, right? One of the big ones is that sometimes there can be very blanket statements made about cultures that are very diverse, right? In the US, a lot of times they'll have cultural competency seminars, right? And they'll say things about Latinx people or Black people or Asian people, but within those groups of people, there are a lot of different communities and a lot of different cultures, right? And sometimes what it does too is that it, as a default, puts the attention on the person rather than putting the attention on the system that is treating the person differently or the system that is not treating the person well. And that's where structural competence comes in. So with structural competence, you're thinking about symptoms, attitudes, diseases that a lot of times we would kind of pin on culture, but understanding that a lot of what we're seeing that we're calling cultural is really a response or a reaction to our society systems and structures treating certain groups of people differently, disadvantaging certain groups of people. So it is something that's less inherent to that group of people and more about the challenges that they're facing in terms of getting what they need, being heard, and even being considered. And so this is this idea of structural competence, where you're taking it out of just thinking about the people or the marginalized population, and you're thinking about what is it that is different about how this population experiences various societal systems that are framing their world and their lives. So this talk is really going to be about structural competence or structural humility more so than cultural. So when we think about mental health in adolescents, it may sound strange to start with a definition of mental health, but there's intentionality around it. And the reason why is because even when we say mental health care or mental health, a lot of times we're talking about illness. We're talking about symptoms, we're talking about diagnosis. We don't spend a lot of time on health at all. And I can tell you, I did 3 years of fellowship, 3 years of residency at Harvard, 2 years of child fellowship at Emory, a year of forensic fellowship at Emory. So I did 6 years of training after medical school in psychiatry specifically, and I could name on one hand the number of classes we had where we actually focused on health. Because the focus is on illness. It's on pathology, it's on symptoms, it's on diagnosing people. And mental health care is really a tertiary care system. There's no preventative aspect to it. People don't see us for well child visits the way they see pediatricians for well child visits, right? They only see us when something's gone wrong or there's a problem. And so I wanted to start with a definition of mental health. And this is one from the World Health Organization, that is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So I welcome you to reflect on that definition. There's nothing in that definition about psychiatric diagnoses. There's nothing about symptoms. There's nothing about rating scales or criminogenic risk. There's nothing about whether people are compliant with their medication, right? So much of it has to do with relationships with family, relationships with community, and it also has to do with the opportunities that are available to them or not in their society to fulfill this ideal of what being mentally healthy looks like. So as you often see, right, you can tell that this definition was kind of written with adults in mind, and that's the default. Kids, in a lot of ways, are often an afterthought. And adultism, which is an ism we don't talk about much, is a whole other talk. But given this definition, we're going to extrapolate to kids a little bit. So this is just my extrapolation. This isn't the World Health Organization. This is me talking. But taking from that definition, youth who are able to develop healthy emotional, intellectual, and social functioning, able to explore, practice, and implement a growing repertoire of adaptive skills for identifying and handling difficult emotions and stressful situations, able to advance academically and occupationally to the best of their ability, and able to play a positive, developmentally appropriate role in their families and in communities. This is what mental health looks like. It's not, is their PHQ-9 rating scale down to a 3, and are they going to school, and are they compliant with medications? It's, are they able to dream, and are they in a position to act in a way that helps them actualize what that dream is? And so when we think about mental health, right, so much of that is going to depend on if they're safe, it's going to depend on if they're secure, it's going to depend on if they have adults who can help them figure out their place in the world, it's going to depend on educational opportunity and the resources that they may need to get help if and when that comes up. And so this isn't just about that individual child, and it's not even just about that child's family, it's about the structures in place to support that child's family, or the structures that are falling short in supporting that child's family. So defining social justice, and there are lots of definitions of it. This is the one that we'll just use for today, and it's from John Rawls. It says, assuring the protection of equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, as well as taking care of the least advantaged members of society. And today we've talked a lot about mental health. We've talked about the mental health judicial interface, and I think we can all agree that they are some of the most marginalized members of society. You superimpose being a child on top of it, being voiceless, not having rights, being at the mercy of systems to take care of you. And when you think about that intersection of justice-involved youth who have mental health issues, who are also children, they definitely qualify in that category of the least advantaged members of society. So when we talk about health disparities, there's often this notation, oh, it's interesting that lower socioeconomic kids end up in juvenile justice more. The statistics show us that, right? It's kind of looked at as something that we should, take note of. But sometimes we don't take the next step of wondering why that difference is there. And with health inequities, which is a little bit different than disparities, you're not just acknowledging that there's a difference, but you're being deliberate about considering that these differences are the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. That these differences are because of a lack of equity in opportunity and resources, particularly as it relates to the population that's affected by these things. So we've gotten better, right? We've gotten better about thinking about trauma, and Judge Leifman earlier mentioned adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We have these screens, we know to ask people about them. We are talking about it more. And it's good that we screen, and it's good that we try to be more trauma-informed. But the problem with getting to it at that point is that by the time you screen and somebody answers yes to 7 out of 10 traumatic experiences before the age of 18, that exposure has already happened. That risk has already been conveyed. And these are things that we have known for decades are harmful to people. We have known children not having a consistent source of food or security in where they live has negative implications not only for their mental health as adults, but for their physical health as adults as well. And so us knowing, us having this data and these studies telling us that if you expose people to these things, their health is going to be worse, hasn't quite shifted the curve, right? We're still exposing very large portions of our communities, enormous numbers of children and adolescents to these risk factors, knowing what they mean for their future or knowing what they could mean for their future. And the fact that we are not allocating our resources in a way to protect more children from these things that we know are harmful is fundamentally a social justice issue, because we could choose to allocate resources in a way so that there weren't as many exposures to all of these risk factors. And so we talk about the social determinants of mental health as a way of saying, sure, some of this is biological in terms of people's risk, but a lot of this has to do with where people live, work, play, and learn. So we have these social determinants of health, but the thing that determines the social determinants, right, the things that sets those up is how we decide to allocate opportunities and resources. And so fundamentally, that's a social justice issue that comes down to public policies and our social norms. And so some principles of social injustice. And as we go through these, I would ask you to think about how this could apply to what happens in a clinical setting, in a mental health clinic, how it could happen, or how it could apply in court, and how it could apply to how people that you're working with are thinking about the people in front of you, but also the ways that the healthcare system may think about the people who are disproportionately in front of you. So essentialism. So this is the belief that there are distinct, unchanging, and natural characteristics that define social groups and facilitate their categorization. Erasure of context, when there's failure to consider socio-historical context when seeking to understand the etiology of inequities. And an example of that would be the MMPI. Raise your hand if you've heard of the MMPI. Okay, just a few hands. So this is a psychological test, right? That's supposed to be authoritative because it's been used on all these thousands and thousands of people, and it's supposed to be objective and be something you can use in court and rely on because it has all this data and it comes with all these fancy statistics and things like that, right? On the MMPI, if you give it to a Black American person, they raise the paranoia scale. It's not because Black Americans are paranoid inherently as a people. It's because we've lived in a country where we're not safe. Not anxiety, it's not paranoia, it's based on lived experience, right? So that is a context that the test doesn't account for, and that you see people use that test on Black people all the time, and in their write-up and in their evaluation, they don't account for it, right? So there's an erasure of context that is then used to pathologize an individual. Biological determinism, the false belief that racial groups are biologically and genetically different. We know that race is a social construct. And then cultural determinism, the false belief that differences in ethnic groups are the result of cultural factors. I also welcome you to think about types of oppression and how this could impact the people you see, but also how it could get in the way of people being able to achieve that ideal of mental health. How do you get to a mentally healthy place if these are a part of your lived experience on a day-to-day basis? So exploitation, the unequal exchange of one group's labor and energies for another group's advantage and advancement. Cultural imperialism, establishing the ruling class culture as the norm and the othering of groups that are not part of the dominant culture. And a really simple example of this is that often when you go to these cultural competency seminars or where they have dialogue about cross-cultural psychiatry, there's never, ever a discussion about white culture. Never. And that's because white culture is the invisible norm. White culture is really relevant, right? It's the dominant culture, but it's never discussed because everything that's not it is othered and often pathologized. And so that's an example of cultural imperialism. And you see it in the DSM as well. You see it as it relates to race, you see it as it relates to class, and you see it as it relates to adults. And we'll talk a little bit about that later too. Powerlessness, when oppressed groups lack power and are blocked from routes to gaining it. Marginalization, expelling specific groups from meaningful participation in society. A great example of this would be not allowing people with felony records to vote after they have served their terms and are released back into the community. And violence, threats and experiences of physical and structural violence. Now, physical violence, I'm sure you're familiar with. With structural violence, what we're referring to is when systems as they operate are actually harmful to people. So an example of this could be, let me see. An example of this could be an underfunded school system. So I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I have 2 clinics that are maybe 5 miles apart, but the income of one neighborhood versus the other is another couple $100,000, right? The kids in the poorer neighborhood often have learning issues, have intellectual disabilities that haven't been identified. They get frustrated in class, they act out, they're labeled oppositional, right? And so this place where they're supposed to learn, where they're supposed to achieve, where they're supposed to grow, becomes a place where they feel marginalized, becomes a place where they are labeled, becomes a place where they are demoralized. And rather than school being a path to advancement, it becomes a path to the juvenile justice system. That is an example of structural violence. You are harming this person's life trajectory in a place where you're telling them they're supposed to get help. And so when we consider this hierarchy of needs, right, and we think about, again, that definition of mental health, about people being able to cope adaptively and realize their potential, right? There's a requirement there. There's a requirement that people believe they have some power over how their life looks, and there's a requirement that they think that they actually have a future for them to shape. I worked in a juvenile justice facility as a psychiatrist, just providing care for a number of years, and there were many, many boys who I talked to, when I asked them about their future, I hadn't really thought about it, because they didn't assume they were going to have one, because they'd known so many people who didn't, right? And so we'd say things to kids like, stay in school so you can grow up and be you're presuming the kid believes they're gonna grow up, right? And there are a lot of kids who are exposed to things that make them question whether that's going to be the case. So when we're considering mental health, sure, medication and therapy is a part of it, right? But the foundation for it has to do with basic needs being met, and basic needs being met reliably and consistently during really critical developmental times. So thinking about things like food, shelter, clothing, sleep, security, both of their family and of the neighborhoods. Do they have love and belonging and connection with people? Is there a respect that they have for themselves and for other people, for strength and for freedom? And then that is what sets people up. That is what allows people, that is what positions them to have dreams, number one, and to two, think that they can have a role in making those dreams come true. I was recently given a talk, something similar to this at the University of Maryland, and they asked me about policies and mental health. And I told them, the child tax credit was, in my opinion, the biggest mental health policy that I've seen during my career, because it gave families concrete resources that they needed to address child poverty in a way that nothing else I've seen has. And addressing child poverty is the biggest mental health intervention, in my opinion, that we could make right now. It's not about training more psychiatrists. And so that solid foundation, things like a true home, a reliable caregiver, educational opportunity, access to health care. I welcome you to consider how many of the people you see before you in court had these things. How many had these things consistently throughout their childhood, throughout their adolescence, during their adulthood? And I can tell you, it's very, very few of them, and that's not a coincidence. So Judith Herman, in her book, Trauma and Recovery, says the developing child's positive sense of self depends on the caregiver's benign use of power. And Judge Leifman mentioned PTSD earlier, and PTSD was really developed with soldiers in mind, so people who were adults, fully formed human beings, went off to a place where bad things happened and came back home in a place where bad things weren't happening anymore but had symptoms from it. And it was also developed in mind with people who were sexual assault victims, but who didn't know the victimizer and where it was an isolated event. So again, something bad happened, but then you return to some baseline. Judith Herman was a psychiatrist at Harvard. I actually had the chance to train under her, but she wrote this book, Trauma and Recovery, and in that book, she described something called complex PTSD. And her argument was that when you have people whose traumas are ongoing, when those traumas happen in the context of a relationship, when those traumas are during critical developmental periods, it's a different kind of injury than if it happens somewhere else, or if it happens from somebody you don't know. Because she was working with these women who had been survivors of incest and child sexual abuse, of domestic violence, of torture, and she saw a different kind of pattern in terms of how it impacted people. And so she came up with this complex PTSD. It's in the ICD, which is the World Health Organization's classification of diseases. It's not in the DSM. I could give you a whole other rant about that. But it is something that has been well validated and understood. And in her book, when she says this, she's talking about caregivers like within the context of a family, But I would argue, and she actually has a recent book about trauma and justice, where she's talking about the way that caregiver isn't just about family, right? It's about the broader society and about how the broader society takes care of people or not. And when we're considering structural trauma, so trauma that's at the hands of a school system that you have to engage with, trauma that's at the hands of a child welfare system that is entrusted with taking care of you when your family cannot, that there are parallels, right, to that complex trauma that is caused by structural trauma as opposed to what we typically think of as PTSD. So is there a way that the structures that have power over the lives of the people you see have been benign in their use of power, or are there ways that they have been harmful? And what could that mean for their thoughts, feelings, or behaviors? What could that mean for their mental health? And I do want to acknowledge, as we're talking about inequities here, right? I am not the expert on this. You could tell me so much more than I could look up or Google, right? But I couldn't be on the stage today here and not acknowledge the inequity between mainland US and Puerto Rico and what you are experiencing here, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that as part of this talk.
Which doll is the black doll? This one. And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
So that video is a fairly recent recreation of the Clark doll experiments. And the Clarks were a husband and wife team of psychologists who did these experiments to demonstrate the mental health harm of segregation and of racism on children, and it was used to help argue for desegregation in the US. Schools are still quite segregated in the US, which is, again, another talk. But it is a striking illustration of how soon, how early we learn who is valued and who is not, who is good and who is bad, who is othered and who is embraced, who automatically gets the benefit of the doubt in terms of being good and who automatically we default to thinking about in negative terms, right? There's nothing malicious about these children. They're repeating, right? They're reflecting what they've seen and heard and seen play out. So I play this video for a few reasons. Obviously, this one is about race, but there are all kinds of social hierarchies, right? Race is one that is quite obvious and has been quite effective in a lot of ways. But there are other hierarchies that relate to where people live, or whether they're rural or urban, or socioeconomic status, or intellectual disability, right? Like, we know where the hierarchies are and who's the good and who's the bad and who's the pretty and who's the desired and who is not. And so this is obviously based on race, but I welcome you to think about other isms that this could help you understand. And I want you to think about how this could play out in court and how it could play out in mental health clinics, right? I'll pick on mental health clinics first, since that's, kind of my home, right? Sometimes there's this idea that, yeah, we have issues with equity and justice, and if we give people mental health care, then they'll be good, like they'll be fine in the medical system. And I wish I could tell you that the medical system was less racist than anybody else, or less ageist, or less sexist, or less patriarchal. It's not. And so what you see in the medical system and the mental health system is that those hierarchies that are in the broader society play out within that system as well. And when it comes to mental health diagnoses, where we don't have x-rays, we don't have lab results, it's more objective, right? We have these criteria, but how you apply them still relies a lot on the person who is applying them, right? So it gives more opportunity for bias to make its way into the diagnostic process. So if I'm a clinician and I'm primed to think of Black boys as bad, that irritability is more likely to be chalked up to them being conduct disorder or oppositional or being antisocial, rather than their irritability being chalked up to them having depression, right? If I think that I already know this is a bad kid, I don't ask him about his abuse history or his history of trauma, because I think I already know the answer, because he is in the bad category, right? And that sounds really simplistic, but there's lots of data to back me up in terms of that happening in clinics across the US every day. So that's one example. In the court system, right, how this could look is that if I already know this kid is from that neighborhood and from that family, and that is what those people do, you know, he's just had bad examples, maybe I don't order that psychological evaluation that reveals he has an IQ of 75 and him not doing his homework isn't because he's bad and doesn't want to do his homework, it's because he doesn't have any idea of what the homework is asking him to do, right? I don't look for other explanations because I think I already know what it is. Whereas if it's a white child who's not doing his homework, you think, well, you know, there must be some explanation, there must be some reason, and you go looking and you find it, right? And what we see is that when it comes to mental health evaluations, they're more likely to be ordered for white kids, white adults, than for Black kids or for Black adults. And it's not that people who are minoritized have fewer traumas that would lead to mental health problems. They actually have more, right? Is that we don't go looking. The court doesn't go looking. Mental health providers don't go looking. And so it's really important to hold that it doesn't require any intent whatsoever on your part to discriminate. But just like these kids, you've been exposed to these messages, these images, these narratives, and it takes really intentional and deliberate correction in order not to perpetuate them. And it happens everywhere all the time, right? But the implications of it happening, given the power that you all hold, is really different. All right, so I'm going to pause here and open it up for comments or questions.
I had a question because obviously you're more from the mental health. What has been your exposure in the judiciary, and have you find that with the passage of time and there's more information and more studies, have there been more openness to, well, to attack those biases?
Yeah, so thank you for your question. And I have, throughout my career, done a split of academic stuff, regular clinical work, and work at the intersection with judicial. So I was a medical director for a competency restoration program that was in a jail in Fulton County. Then I worked in a juvenile justice facility, and now I do forensic mental health consult work. And if you've met 12 judges, you've met 12 different perspectives on how things work, right? And so I will say there are some people that are more receptive to others, or more receptive than others. But I will say that something interesting that's happened throughout this work is that the attorneys, the public defenders, the people who are part of these teams learn too, right? And so I see every report, every interaction as an opportunity to help educate around these things. And I've had people who have come back and told me, thank you, because it's helped me not only understand this client better, but a lot of my other clients better too. And so it's a work in progress, and it's one where I think in some ways, it's easier to have these conversations with lawyers and judges than with mental health professionals, because sometimes mental health professionals think they already know about countertransference and they've been in therapy, and like, so sometimes they're actually a harder audience. What I found is that in kind of going at it from the angle of, I know you want to get this right, because we all want to get this right, sometimes people can be actually quite receptive. It doesn't always work, but I think it's our job to bring it up, and bring it up until it starts to become more of a standard than it currently is. Other questions or comments?
And how does your approach vary from trauma that comes from childhood and maybe a different form of trauma that's more formed in the adolescence?
So the question that relates to childhood trauma versus adolescent trauma, when it comes to childhood trauma, it could be that there are things that people have experienced that took place before they even had command of language, right? So there could be things that they can't remember or tell you about, but you find in their child welfare record, or you learn about from their aunt who knew their mother really well and knew that she was drinking up until the day she delivered the child, right? And so for even just identifying childhood trauma, a lot of it depends on collateral information and record review and that sort of thing. They may not be able to articulate it to you because there's a way that their body and their brain may remember. So I can see in their behavior and looking back at their notes that this thing has happened, but they may not be able to articulate what that thing was. And so it becomes a matter of getting that information, but then helping the court understand how this ties into these things that you saw that happened early in life. So by way of example, I recently evaluated somebody, and I talked to his aunt, and she was like, he was bad from the time he was 2. Somebody's bad starting at, right? Starting at 2, right? You wonder, right? Turns out mother was using substances. She had a history of sexual violence at the hands of her father. Some of her other siblings had even had children from her father, right? There was a way that whenever this child expressed extreme emotions, the mom couldn't handle it, right? She responded to him in a punitive, aggressive way, and he reacted in kind, right? But he couldn't articulate any of that, right? But there were ways that it was clear that that had impacted his neurodevelopment and in turn impacted his behavior really throughout his life. It's coming.
So thinking about judging these kinds of situations, I just wanted to ask if it would be positive in interdisciplinary evaluation to consider also a psychiatrist, but also a neuropsychologist that would help us know more about the developmental elements?
Absolutely, and so the question relates to interdisciplinary approaches, and yes, when you can have that, that is ideal, right? Because what you don't want to recreate is the siloing that happens in these different systems, and you see that happen with mental health. And forgive me, those of you who were there yesterday, but I was once asked to do a psychiatric evaluation on a young man who had been victimized himself sexually and then had recreated something with his younger brother. I was asked to do a psychiatric, so I asked the lawyer, well, you know, what else are you getting? Like, what's the workup been? And she's like, well, I'm asking for a psychological and I'm asking for a psychosexual. And I was like, what do you want 3 different reports for? Like, what are you trying to do? And she was like, well, they're considering him for early release, and so the judge wants to know how big of a risk is he, and so we're getting these different reports. And I was like, I can, just let me do the report, right? And so I did the psychological, I did the psychosocial history, I did the psychiatric history, and was able to actually talk about this child as a whole person and paint a picture for the court that helped them understand not only how he ended up doing what he did, but also what he needed in order to decrease his risk. And it was much more useful than if they'd gotten, you know, 3 different reports from people who were just doing the standard evaluation. And so, yes, that interdisciplinary lens can be helpful, or having someone who has kind of taken on that interdisciplinary lens or has that team. But the really critical thing is that when you ask for a report, that you let people know what you're trying to use it for. because you have people who will just do their kind of standard rote plug-and-play report, and it doesn't end up necessarily helping you a whole lot. So let them know what you're using it to help, inform or decide. Well, thank you all. Any other comments? Okay. So what I would ask you to think about, just given this introduction to social injustice, is how social injustice and inequity and the messages of marginalization, how have they impacted the direction and development of you or of people on your team, and how have they impacted it of those you judge or of those who end up court involved. So early impressions matter. And the example of what concrete is one that's nice, right? If you have concrete that's dried, it's not that you can't still crack it or have anything happen to it. It's just a lot harder compared to if you get in while the concrete is still wet, while it's still easily molded. And to a degree, there's something similar that happens with the brain. When you're young, you're taking in more. Your brain is literally growing. It's also literally pruning and being more effective at which pathways connect with what and what associations are made. And so there's a way that when something happens earlier in life, it's going to impact you in a different way. And it's not that that can't be treated or addressed, but it's hard set. It is wired into you in a way that's different than if you were a fully functioning adult with a fully functioning brain that has already matured and something happens to you. So as I mentioned to you all before, I grew up in this small town in Florida. It's called Pace. I'm sure none of you have ever heard of it. And it's right over the bridge from Pensacola, which maybe you've heard about, which is a kind of moderate-sized city, but certainly not big by anybody's standards. But for us, Pensacola was the big city. So Pace had a Hardee's, a Piggly Wiggly, and a flashing yellow light. And Piggly Wiggly is like this local country store. You only see it in rural America. And for us, when I was growing up, we had ABC, NBC, and CBS News, right? So you had to watch one of those three to get your nightly news every evening. Pensacola, because it was the big city for us, but not actually really a big city, was only on ABC. They didn't talk about Pensacola on NBC or CBS. They talked about Mobile, Alabama instead, which was like the next neighboring city. So what that meant is that as someone who grew up next to Pensacola, my family was in Pensacola, I ended up watching ABC News. I ended up watching Good Morning America. I ended up watching World News Tonight on ABC because that is what followed our local news coverage. Go back to a few years ago when, things were really stressful in the United States and I could only handle so much news at a time, right? I was like, well, I don't want to be totally unplugged, but I got to see something, right? And I defaulted to watching George Stephanopoulos and World News Tonight and ABC News, right? Not that it's necessarily better, right? I could have been missing some good stuff on CBS or NBC. I didn't know because I defaulted to what was familiar because that is what I grew up with, right? And we all do that to a certain degree. And in that example, probably nothing major happened as a result of me defaulting to what I was familiar with. But there's a way that illustrates what we all do, right? We default to what we know. And sometimes defaulting to what we know results in us repeating things that actually aren't adaptive, that actually aren't helpful, that actually do have consequences. But it's a natural thing that we do because of how wet that concrete is, because of what we call, in some kind of psychobabble, the neuroplasticity of the early brain, that it is affected by things in a different way. And so as I mentioned, have a clinic in a nice part of Atlanta, a clinic in a marginalized, redlined, socioeconomically deprived part of Atlanta, and I've also taken care of people who are incarcerated and done evaluations of them. And so these are three people who I asked the same thing. Tell me about your childhood. And these are responses that I received. So one was a software programmer who was seeing me in my private practice, thought he had some ADHD and wanted to be able to, code better. And when I asked him that question, his reply to me was, school was all I ever really had to worry about. One was an adult capital murder mitigation evaluee. So I was seeing him when he was in his late 30s, early 40s. When I asked him about his childhood, he said I was proud to make it to 21 even though I was in prison. And the third was a youth who was detained at a juvenile justice center who said, "They say I'm supposed to care about people when ain't nobody cared for me." And so we'll call the young man who was proud to make it to 21 Miguel for the sake of this. I've changed his name, of course. But he had been incarcerated from the age of 17 to 21. He was put in an adult prison during that critical developmental period on the cusp of his adulthood because of a violation of plan after being found in possession of a small amount of marijuana, and his original charge had been nonviolent. So this was his environment. He was in a state that had low per capita mental health spending, some of the lowest in the country. There was chronic child protective services understaffing, so none of his child welfare workers who were charged with his welfare actually knew this child. And there was a very punitive stance toward adolescents. So it was a time where there was a mantra: you do adult crime, you get adult time, right? He was in 12 different foster care placements during his childhood and adolescence. And he had unmet educational needs. So they knew he had learning issues, but they weren't consistently addressed because they just couldn't be when you're changing school so much. And he had unmet mental health needs as well. He had attempted suicide the first time when he was 8 years old by trying to jump out of a car. And he'd actually forgotten about it until we ended up talking about it during our evaluation. That's how full of trauma and badness his childhood was. And even with that, the state didn't make sure that he had consistent mental health services. He was exposed to neighborhood violence, housing and food instability, and victimization by his peers and his brother, and had a mother with untreated sexual trauma and substance use disorder, grandmother who'd abandoned him, and his father and brother were imprisoned, and he was abused by multiple members of his family. So sometimes we will think about the family dysfunction, we'll think about the neighborhood dysfunction, right? But we don't think as much about the system that was supposed to take care of him when his family could not, that was really set up not to do it well. And so what we see is that these unmet needs, going back to that pyramid I brought up earlier, it is a perfect mirror of the risk factors for being involved in the juvenile justice system. Not a coincidence. So when we look at statistically who is more likely to end up in juvenile court, things like poverty, instability, child victimization, maltreatment, problem behaviors in family, all of those things that impact your ability to achieve that mental health ideal are also going to impact your decision making. They're going to impact potential survival behaviors. They're going to impact things that could raise the attention, right, of a police officer because attention wasn't raised by a parent or a child welfare worker earlier upstream. So what we see, and I would say that this is a underestimation, but if we're conservative, 70% of youth in the juvenile justice system have mental illness and 30% have serious mental illness, so things like bipolar disorder. So we're coming back to the young man that said, "They say I'm supposed to care about people when ain't nobody cared for me." So when I met him, he was detained. I think he was actually in on an armed robbery charge. 15 years old. In the state of Georgia, if you're in for armed robbery, you're tried as an adult as long as you're 13 years old or older. So he was facing adult armed robbery charges at 15. And this was, kind of his rap sheet. So he was a repeat offender, had a gang affiliation, had been truant from school, had been defiant toward his father, had these robbery charges, and someone had described him as callous. So that's his rap sheet. But this is his story. So he was a young child, probably before he had the language to remember it, but he was in the home when his mother was murdered. This had happened in Chicago. He didn't have family there they could take him, so they shipped him down to Georgia, where he was put in the care of this father who didn't know him, who had never raised a child, let alone a traumatized child. And the father just wasn't really ready to be a father, so he wasn't present. And the academic and mental health needs he had went unmet. His father started to pay attention to him once he got into trouble, but at that point, Andre felt like his father was too late. They didn't really have much of a relationship at that point. He had unmet physical needs as well. And even with everybody knowing his backstory about the trauma that he had experienced, no one had bothered to get him mental health care. He never saw a mental health professional until he was locked up for armed robbery 10 years after being in the house where his mother was killed. While detained, he finally got mental health interventions. He got therapy. I saw him for medication treatment. And something interesting happened. He actually emerged as a leader in a positive way among his peers and was academically engaged now that those things had been treated and he was in an environment where that was reinforced. And so in his case, his development, right, we talk about diversion, but how did he get there? His development was marked by trauma and poverty that set the stage for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. He had a loss of community after his mother's murder and older brothers with gang involvement and imprisonment. He was in underperforming school districts that would not prepare him for college and where his needs were not met. So there's actually, ways you can look up and look at, college preparedness for graduates. The school district that he was zoned for, if he graduated high school, out of people who graduate from that high school, only 30% are college or career ready. So when the kids tell you there's no point, I'm not learning anything, there's actually something to it, right? And the reality was there was more opportunity and proximity to gangs than there was to pro-social activities for him. Andre, like most of the kids I saw at the facility, smoked marijuana every day and have been smoking marijuana every day since they were about 14 years old. And so you saw self-medication and you saw a certain degree of hypervigilance as his default tools for handling difficult emotions and stressful situations. Marijuana was much more accessible to him than Prozac was, right? What was modeled to him was that you smoke to calm yourself down, and that is what he did. When you look at risk factors for gang involvement, aggressiveness, early initiation of violent behavior, and substance use. That aggressiveness can come from all kinds of things, right? You can see it with PTSD, you can see it with depression, you can see it with situations where you feel, your perception is either I have to act or I'm going to be victimized. Looking at family, things like parental criminality, child maltreatment, low levels of parental involvement, and parent-child separation, all of which had impacted him. In an academic environment where there's academic failure and poor school connectedness. And when there is poor school connectedness, a lot of times it's put on the child, well, why don't you go to school? Why aren't you invested in school? There's less of a question of, is the school investing appropriately in this child? Do they have the resources to assess them for their learning needs and make sure that they're actually meeting them where they are? And so he disengaged from school. And then these neighborhood risk factors, like violence, peer gang membership, poverty, community disorganization. And so sometimes what you see, right, is that people have these needs. They have a need for safety. They have a need for belonging. They have a need for esteem. And sometimes when that can't be found in the context of a family, when that can't be found in the context of a football team or some pro-social environment, children find it somewhere else. And sometimes they find it in a gang. The gang becomes the place where they feel safe, or they at least have the perception that they're safe or that somebody's protecting them. It becomes a replacement family. It becomes a place where they get feedback from adults that they are valued. And it may even become a place where they start to achieve. This wasn't the case with Andre, but I actually had one case of an evaluation, and he was an adult when I saw him. He's actually on death row in Tennessee. But he talked about how he didn't bother learning to read until he joined a gang and started selling drugs, because then reading became relevant, because he needed to read street signs. He was capable of it. He never saw the point before. And so when we look at justice-involved youth, there are population risk factors, and there are also developmental considerations. But there's a way, right, that when it comes to gangs and things like that, proximity really can lead you astray. So live in the southeast region of the United States. In the southeast US, college football is king. College American football, not soccer. And there are heated battles between your rivals when it comes to college football. And I'm from Florida originally, but I live in Georgia now, and Florida and Georgia are big-time rivals. But because I live in Georgia, right, I'm surrounded by Georgia Bulldog fans, and I tolerate it because, that's where I live and that's where my job is. But if you look at a lot of statutes, or you look at a lot of determinations of who's in a gang or who's gang affiliated, a lot of it has to do with where you live and with who you're around. And as an adult, I could move to Florida if being around Georgia Bulldog fans bothered me that much. As a kid, you really don't have much of a choice. And so a lot of times what you'll see is that assumptions are made about gang affiliation, assumptions are made about children's views of gang based on things that they really have no control over and based on what neighborhood they happen to be in. I recently had an evaluation, I kid you not, they charged this kid with a gang charge, or a gang enhancement, as they call it, in Fulton County. And this child was in a gang rap video at 4 years old. Because it was his family, right? It was his family's rap video, and he's the kid they're like dancing with in the video. Like, he made no choice about that, right? This is the family he was born into, and this is something they were using against him to enhance his charges. But he was not in any way sociopathic. He was not a kid who was gang affiliated, but based on the criteria they used that really relied on proximity, they could check it off and throw this at this child. So something to keep in mind when it comes to teens is that, you know, when it comes to a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, you're talking to them, you know it's not the same. Talking to an adult, they look smaller, they're really cute, right? There's a difference. Sometimes when you talk to teenagers, they may be the same size as you. Certainly, I'm 5'2", so they're like often bigger than I am. But there's a way that they have language, right? That they can sound really logical when you're discussing things with them, especially when it's not the heat of the moment. They can sound like adults, and they can have adult reasoning. And so there's a way that sometimes we want to treat them like adults or punish them like adults. But what we know is that their brains, their psychology, their socialization, all have very significant critical differences that impact their decisions, their identity, and their behavior. So comparing a 17-year-old brain to a 27-year-old brain, there are big differences, even an 18-year-old brain to a 27-year-old brain. And what we see is that in situations where it's emotional and situations where there's peer pressure, that the way they make decisions, the parts of their brain that light up and kind of take over and direct things are different than when it comes to adult brains. And there's a certain level of maturation you expect.
Take a look at these four.
Yeah, I'll go to this next one.
Take a look at these 4 kids. These preschool teachers watched a video of them playing for a 2016 study. The study asked them to press the enter key every time they saw a behavior that could become a potential challenge. But the thing about the study is it's kind of deceptive. There's actually no misbehavior in the video. The kids are actors, and the researchers were using eye tracking software because what they really wanted to know was when teachers expect misbehavior, who are they watching? The study found that both white and black teachers spent more time gazing at black boys than other children. Black boys make up less than a quarter of the nation's preschoolers, but more than 40% of preschool suspensions. The study's lead researcher told the Washington Post that implicit biases don't begin with black men and police. They begin with black preschoolers and their teachers, if not earlier.
Preschool. And so when we think about schools, we think about opportunity. There's what happens in school that's important, but then there's also what happens and what you're exposed to if you're not in school. That's also important, right? You think about who your peers are if you're expelled from school. You think about who you're around on the streets if you're not in school during school hours. And there's not just the risk factor of not being engaged in school, there's the risk factor of all the things that happen on the streets at those times when you should have been in school. So, I would like all of you to solve this problem. I don't see any like paper and pencils, like what's... So she said, I need to realize what it is first, right? This happens in schools all the time, right? Where you have kids who are asked to do something they cannot do, they don't know how to do. And in our cases, you know, we're all adults, we can laugh, we're in a session, you're a little kid. This is the teacher. The teacher already thinks you're bad. Your classmates already tease you for being slow. It's hard to raise your hand and say, I don't get it. I don't understand. Right? And so what you see, yes, there's an overrepresentation of minoritized racial groups in the justice system. There's also a huge overrepresentation of people with learning issues and of people with intellectual disabilities. There's an attorney I work with in Georgia who has been defending essentially poor Black kids in Atlanta for almost all of her career. And because she's done that work for so long, she can pretty much, based on people's disciplinary record, predict if they have a mental health issue or an intellectual disability. And she makes it a point that she doesn't just defend their criminal charges. She goes back and she sues the school or threatens to sue the school to do the special education evaluation of the child they should have done 5 years ago, and to provide that child with services. So she sees her representation of them as not just the juvenile justice charges, but also the educational advocacy, because there is always a connection that could be made that should have been made some time ago with the children that she's defending. And so I welcome you to always keep that in mind too. And so when it comes to children and adolescents, there are gene-environment interactions. So for a while there was the debate, nurture versus nature. Are you born with it or is it your environment? And what we found out is that that's really a false debate, that there's an interaction between what you're born with and what you're exposed to, between the genes and the environment. And so you could be born with a vulnerability to a mental health issue or to impairments in judgment or to emotional reactivity, and then what you experience increases the likelihood that that actually ends up manifesting. When you're looking at adolescents, what you find is that their emotional circuits, their reward system is in full gear, their ability to weigh pros and cons and to diligently weigh things still being developed, and so you have more gas, less brakes compared to an adult. And with substance use, as was mentioned earlier, the earlier you're exposed to substances, going back to that wet concrete idea, the more likely it is that you go from somebody who just uses substances to somebody who abuses them. Most people who use addictive substances, even stuff like cocaine, don't necessarily become addicted to it. The people who become addicted to it are often folks who used earlier or who have histories of trauma. And so when you're thinking about this population that had a lot of exposure to trauma, that often had a lot of accessibility to substances, it's one that is going to be more likely to have trouble with substance use disorders. And then thinking about the pre and perinatal environment. So intergenerational trauma is a huge consideration. There may have been alcohol or other substance use exposure in the womb. And what you see with fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol syndrome disorders is that their level of impairment doesn't quite match their IQ. So their IQ may seem okay or like borderline okay, but they're more impaired than you would think just based on that alone. And really it takes that family history to know if that exposure occurred. When it comes to trauma and how people develop, right? Their self-concept, their stress responses, and their perceptions of the larger society. So all of us have coping skills. It's just a matter of whether those coping skills are adaptive or not, whether they get us in trouble or not, right? And so that definition of mental health acknowledges that things will be stressful, but you have adaptive ways to cope with that stress, whereas in some situations, those coping mechanisms may get you in trouble. So at least 33% of detained youth have learning disabilities. That is probably an undercount, just given what we know about how school districts are often funded. When we look at child poverty, we see that there's an overrepresentation of people who came from poverty in the system. In Puerto Rico, 57% of children live in poverty, and that's set at a benchmark of $26,500 for a family of 4. So that benchmark is problematic in and of itself. There are lots of people who are going to be above that but still not be able to meet basic needs, so there's a way that that's an artificially deflated number. And 51% have parents who lack secure employment. So when we go back to that definition of mental health, when we go back to that pyramid about needs, you can see how this is a major issue when it comes to mental well-being and when it comes to risk factors for juvenile justice involvement. Because even when you just consider crimes of survival and that are about having basic needs met, you could see how this would set people up to be involved with those things. So when you look at families who are involved with the juvenile justice system, not surprisingly, 80% come from families on public assistance or incomes under $30,000 per year. And so those foundational things we talked about are all going to be negatively impacted by poverty. And poverty is going to increase the chance that they need medical and mental health services because it's bad for your physical and your mental health. But then it's also going to pose a barrier to people getting the help that they need once that need is identified. And so early assaults matter. Just like my early exposure to George Stephanopoulos and ABC News shaped me, right? Early exposure to bad things can make you think the world is a scary place where you have to get them before they get you, right? And there's a way that that message can seep in differently when it's repeated early and often. So what you see in the juvenile justice system is 90% have experienced at least one trauma, 84% more than one, and 75% traumatic victimization. And I would say that this is an undercount too, because again, when we're thinking about cultural imperialism in the DSM doesn't ask about, have people in your neighborhood been shot to death? It doesn't ask about racial violence. It doesn't ask about ongoing violence. There are all these things we don't ask about because they affect marginalized communities. So I can tell you, every kid I saw, those 5 years working in a juvenile justice facility, had significant trauma histories. So what you see is that things that help them survive, that help them live on the streets, are problems once they get into a classroom, or once they're not in that environment anymore. But when you're in an environment where you don't have the luxury of weighing pros and cons and thinking things through because you might die, you can see how you become reactive, how you become irritable, how you may operate in a different way in the world. So, fire alarm went off right now. What would you do? I'm hearing some. Look around, right? So I heard a couple people say run, but really, probably what would happen is you look around. Is anybody else running? Is there smoke? Do I smell anything weird? Do the people who work here seem alarmed, right? So an alarm's going off, but you're not gonna have a dramatic response because you're gonna gather more information and decide, the alarm tells me I need to get more information, doesn't necessarily tell me I need to run, because most of you have probably been in rooms where fire alarms have gone off and there was no fire, right? So what if your life experience was that every single time a fire alarm went off, there was a fire? Then you're gonna get up and run when you hear a fire alarm, right? So when it comes to feelings of anxiety or stress, for those of us who grew up in a safe environment, when I felt anxious, nothing that bad ever really happened, right? So I have the ability to, when I feel anxious or stressed, gather more information, look around, think about it before I react or respond. But if I was a kid who that feeling of anxiety was paired with my stepfather throwing something at my head, right? That alarm is going to elicit a different kind of reaction, more of a reaction than a response. Because I've been taught alarm means go. Alarm means you're in danger. Alarm means something bad is about to happen. And when you've been traumatized, it breeds this reactivity, and that reactivity helped you survive before, right? But now it's getting in the way. And so trauma can affect how people think, how people feel, how they behave, how they see themselves, how they see the world. And it could have really different effects on different people. There are some people who experience trauma and who come out with this mentality, well, the world is a place where either you're the aggressor or you're the one who is the victim, and I'm not gonna be the victim, so I'm gonna be the aggressor. And you have some people who come out of it who say, my best bet is just not to be noticed, and to shrink, and to be small, and to not seem like I'm a threat to anyone. So rather than being aggressive, they fall back, right? So there's no one manifestation of it, but I want you to understand that almost every mental health symptom you can think of can be tied to or because of trauma. And what we also know is that every mental health condition, even things like schizophrenia that are thought to be more biological, the risk of schizophrenia goes up the more trauma you're exposed to, and certainly when you're a child. So what does this mean for records? What it means is that given the bias in our system, given the issues with access, given the ways that we don't count traumas that impact marginalized populations, there could be a failure of recognition of mental health issues because you think you already know or they're just a bad person. And there could be a stigma that's attached to that person. It could be that when you're looking at their chart, there are surface diagnoses and surface descriptions. And it could be that this person who has gone through the educational system that failed them, the child welfare system that failed them, the juvenile justice system that failed them, that when they come into your system, they're not gonna think you're gonna do right by them either, and that they're going to carry that in their interactions. They could have symptoms that are getting in the way of them being able to follow what's happening, right? And it could look like they're disinterested or not engaged or not remorseful when really they're depressed or they're preoccupied by the voices in their heads. and these diagnoses haven't been made and treatment hasn't been given. And then, of course, there are structural barriers to them being able to get help. So many people who need help have never been diagnosed, not because the symptoms aren't real, but because there is inequitable access to the person who would give you the diagnosis. Everyone in this room, if you're sick, you can go to a doctor and you get help. It's not that easy for most of the people who stand in front of you. When you have learning disabilities, this is going to have implications in school and conversation, and certainly in court as well, and just understand that you cannot rely on it to have been previously identified. And there's impacts on academic performance, school attendance, and how they perform academically. In primary care records, what you may find is that there are diagnoses of mental health conditions. And even if you don't put a lot of weight in the diagnoses, consider that a red flag that there is something going wrong or something that's been a problem. And when it comes to mental health, the big take home is that no record or no prior diagnosis does not mean that there's no mental health history, because there are so many barriers to being able to access care. And in so many of the cases that you see, part of the issue is that the caregivers themselves have been limited. The caregivers themselves haven't been able to be present. To be a child to get a mental health diagnosis, you have to have an adult call, make an appointment, and take you to the appointment. If the issue is you haven't had a reliable adult in your life, that's not going to happen, right? And so understand no record does not mean no problem. And so what you see is that there's synergistic structural racism, there's synergistic structural, all kinds of isms that end up impacting these youth, and that there are implications for how they interact with the system. And so when you're going through the evaluation process, right, it could be that they had limited access to mental health treatment, they didn't have the right testing they needed, there could have been bias in how they were disciplined, right? So you're looking at this kid's record and like, oh my God, this is terrible. And forgetting that starting in preschool, if he's a Black boy, then people looked at him more and tried to find him being bad more. And there's also a potential bias in forensic mental health evaluators and in mental health professionals. When it comes to plea bargaining, it could be that they have trouble engaging because of mistrust in systems, or they may be short-sighted in how they evaluate options because they're not thinking long-term. And there may even be difficulty with abstract thinking if there's one of those undiagnosed, unaddressed intellectual issues. In court, they may be triggered by power differentials because historically, power differentials have not gone well for them. They may feel overwhelmed by the decisions that are being made. And it could be that they look disconnected or uncaring when really it's the result of an unaddressed mental health issue. And when you think about the community plan, right, the things you're asking people to do, non-compliance may be due to a lack of readily accessible resources. And when we make plans that don't take into account individual and family limitations, there's a lot of it that is less to do with their willingness to do what you ask them and more to do with their access to the tools that are necessary to do what you've asked of them. And so even if you get someone therapy, even if you get people medications, right, that's like a wheelchair equivalent, that's an individual tool you're giving somebody, understand this society was not constructed for marginalized populations. So there has to be a ramp. We have to give them tools. We have to be intentional about it in terms of addressing the structural part too. We can't just give them a wheelchair and say, go up these stairs. And that's what we do all the time when we tell people go to therapy and take meds and everything will be better. And so for the sake of time, I will go through this, but I'll give you the slides. And so, but just coming back to this direction and healthy development versus diversion, and encouraging you to always pair thinking about direction development with diversion. So where were they directed early on? What is the overall outcome desired now? And the overall outcome should never just be that they take their medication, right? The overall outcome should be that this kid has the opportunity to dream about what they want to be, that they're supported and encouraged in doing that, and they're given concrete tools in order to make that a reality. Development, what has supported or warped their healthy development, and what is needed to address biopsychosocial impacts? And have they had assessments that are culturally and structurally informed? What are their protective factors, but also what are their risk factors? And then doing education for your staff, for yourself, about development and trauma issues in the communities that you're seeing, and thinking about accommodations for cognitive and communication difficulties. And then which approach meets the person's needs while also accounting for the family, system, and community. And then thinking about what it means to be advocates, right? So coming back to that definition of social justice and that definition of mental health, how can every child realize their own potential, work productively and fruitfully, and make a contribution to her or his community in a society that fails to assure equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities and chooses not to care for its least advantaged members. And I would posit that we can't have a mentally healthy society until we have a just one. And all of you have a voice, all of you have a platform, and there are ways that you are able to use your power, right, to raise these issues. You can do what you can for the individuals that are in front of you in court, but I would charge you with using your platforms to advocate for a society that takes better care of kids and families in the first place, right? That doesn't expose so many youth to things that we know are detrimental to their mental well-being. And with that, I will pause, and I don't know if I have time. Yeah. A question from the internet.
Yes, we have a question from
Okay.
our virtual audience. Can you elaborate on the correlation between addiction and trauma?
Yes, so it was asked about the correlation between addiction and trauma. So what you see is that, as I mentioned, most people who use addictive substances do not become addicted to it. So most of you in this room have probably used alcohol, but it's not a room full of people with alcohol addiction, right? With trauma, what you see are a few things. So when you're thinking about what shapes behavior, there's something called negative reinforcement, which is I do something and it takes away an unpleasant feeling that I have. So if I'm traumatized and I'm going through life anxious, worried about the next thing bad that's going to happen, or I'm traumatized and I'm having trouble sleeping, or I'm traumatized and I'm having difficulty feeling comfortable around people because being around people hasn't gone so well for me before, I use this substance and all of a sudden I feel calm. And I'm not walking around feeling like I'm on eggs and needles, or I'm not walking around feeling like I'm on pins and needles, and I feel like more at peace than I have. It's taken away this negative feeling that I've carried around with me. And so alcohol just isn't something that you do to feel nice or to get a buzz. It's something that you do to feel normal and to feel relief. And when you start using that early on in life, that brain that's more wet concrete, that has that increased neuroplasticity, says, oh, this works, right? So that gets reinforced. Your brain becomes more sensitive to it. And the other thing that happens is you start relying on alcohol and you stop looking for other things to help, right? So it's not just that you're using the alcohol, it's that you're not developing other more adaptive ways of coping with those feelings and with that anxiety and with that stress. And so it's that it causes that negative reinforcement, but it also can get in the way of those normal developmentally adaptive things you should be trying out as a teen to figure out what works for you.
Everything that goes around them that impacts them negatively, that they just learn to not react. And that's learned helplessness. And that's something that we also need to consider whenever we have a client before us, because there are going to be persons that are going to act resistant maybe, or are going to look resistant or reluctant to change or whatever, but really they are just unable to help themselves or to form an opinion or to actually ask for help. So that's something that we really need to consider, because that's the opposite of what we usually see maybe in my office as a therapist or in the court system. And it's something that we don't look and that we do not consider, but it's very important in order to be fair and treat the person with dignity and be socially competent. So that's what I wanted to say.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And there's people often talk about fight or flight, right? But there's another F, that's freeze. And so that can help you understand not only sometimes what happens in court, but also the circumstances of the crime, right? The kid was in the car and they were committing the armed robbery and they didn't run away, they didn't do anything, they just stood there, right? So that can be taken as they were going along with it. They might have just froze, right? And so that can happen too. So thank you for that.